These ancient words from the Hebrew Scriptures remind us that for all our celebration of the individual journey, and for all the temptations around us to live as merely self-interested individual consumers, we are still very much indebted and shaped by that interdependent web of relationships of which we are a part. Because Unitarian Universalists are such a diverse movement of seekers, it's natural that the variety of themes that we explore in worship tend to emphasize the personal quest. But today, I want to invite you to join me in putting it all together. This morning, I want to explore with you how we spread our individual experiences of abundance and purpose throughout an institution, and how our personal journeys for fulfillment might connect with a spiritual community in meaningful and transformative ways. One of the most important resources I've used in my ministry over the past 20 years has been psychologist James Fowler's book, Stages of Faith. Not only did it affirm my intuition as a young man that religion was a journey rather than a destination, it also clarified what the point of this journey was. Although I've shared Fowler's questions with you before, I'd like to begin by calling on them once again. Fowler asks us, what are you spending and being spent for? What commands and receives your best time, your best energy? What causes, dreams, goals, or institutions are you pouring your life out for? As you live your life, what power or powers do you dread or fear? What power or powers do you rely on or trust? To whom or what are you committed in life? How about in death? With whom do you share your most sacred and private hopes for your life and for the lives of those you love? And lastly, what are those most sacred hopes, those most compelling goals and purposes in your life? I was just starting to recognize the importance of questions like these when I first attended a Unitarian Universalist congregation in 1986. My family had left the Catholic Church when I was 6, and I had learned to be suspicious about the power of religious institutions. I first visited a UU congregation because a friend of mine was conducting a service there about censorship. And I was impressed that they all seemed to see the world as I did. And so I began to attend each Sunday, a little amused to be part of a church where even atheists were welcome. Although I was constantly on the lookout for signs that the church might be trying to tell me what to believe. I sang along with the hymns, although I read ahead and skipped the words I didn't personally agree with, especially the G word. I got a lot out of being a member of my congregation in spite of my prickliness and my defensiveness, but my involvement at that time was mostly about getting my personal needs met. Looking back on my first couple of years as a Unitarian Universalist, I understand now that my relationship with our movement wasn't unusual. There are some people who discover our congregations in a time of need, such as when families are seeking a minister to officiate a memorial service. But what first attracts many people to Unitarian Universalism is their sense of what individual acceptance and satisfaction it can offer us. After a while, though, I noticed my priorities were beginning to shift, such that Unitarian Universalism was making me a different person even when I was outside of church. I started to focus less on what my congregation could give me and more on how I could put my skills and gifts to use there. I joined the board as worship chair, thinking that my interests might be a good fit for that position, and, well, you see where that has gotten me. Be warned, those of you who are called for the board duty. I had gifts that needed to be given, and I recognized that my congregation was one especially good place where I could share them. Even after years in the ministry, I'm struck at how I still need reminders of this. Working on my doctorate for the last several years, my primary connection with Unitarian Universalism has been moments like this, when I'm preaching in a different congregation each Sunday. I realized in the past year how much I miss the depth of an ongoing connection and continuing commitments, and so I rejoined my previous congregation in Madison, this time as a member, and I'm finding so much joy in participating in that particular community again. Again, I've come to realize that this evolving experience of membership is not unusual. Just as our individual beliefs and needs change over the course of our lives, we also experience changes in our connection to a spiritual community and what we experience by being there. When I and other leaders attended a workshop several years ago about how to better support our members, we learned how to think about this changing community involvement in terms of 4 useful categories. Newcomers to our congregations might be thought of as window shoppers. They're looking for a community that feels like a match for their personal needs and interests. So they'll want to know what this community stands for. What kinds of people are accepted here, and what will be expected of them? For those of you who are shopping around for a place that will respect and support your journey, I hope that you'll find this congregation a safe and hospitable place to grow, and I hope that you'll come back to find out more. As people become regular attendees of our programs and services, they often do so as consumers, thinking of these activities as something that they've purchased with their financial support of the congregation. They may even base their contributions on how much it would have cost to do something similar instead, like having lunch at a coffee shop or going out to a movie. And they often evaluate our programs by the same criteria that they would use for a lecture or a concert. Now, in some ways, this kind of thinking is great because it motivates members to help pay the bills. But it overlooks the ways in which a spiritual community is very different from attending a movie or a lecture. Also, when the inevitable happens and a program disappoints us or the institution fails us, it's tempting to feel cheated, that we're not getting our money's worth, or that a contract has been broken. What we see when our relationship deepens into greater trust and mutuality is that our consumers become shareholders. They feel a sense of responsibility for the health of this institution, and their participation happens as an expression of gratitude rather than as a transaction. These leaders have a stake in a larger cause, and they take their involvement seriously because they recognize that the transformation that happened in them can be made possible for others as well. Now, if we can keep from burning out these folks with our enthusiasm for their skills and their generosity, many of them take it to the next level of investor. These leaders understand their membership and their involvement as part of the long-term success of this congregation and of Unitarian Universalism as a whole. They think about their gifts as something that will outlive them. One colleague compares it to supporting the local public library. It's important to ensure that it survives in our community so that future generations will benefit from it as we have. Now, this set of 4 categories is just one way of thinking about how our relationship with the community can develop over time. It might sound like I'm suggesting that there's an ideal form of membership, that we should all be behaving as investors. But our congregations always naturally contain all four kinds of people. And this is why we don't want to settle into a one-size-fits-all approach about how each of us participates in community. James Fowler's work in faith development reminds us that we naturally move from stage to stage when it's the right time for us. And the right time depends partly on what else is going on in our lives. I tried to keep this in mind as I met with potential members at the First Unitarian Society of Madison. One of my favorite responsibilities when I was one of their ministers was the fourth session of our new UU program for people considering officially becoming members. The previous sessions having talked about Unitarian and Universalist history, the history of the congregation, our culture of lifespan religious education, and opportunities for involvement, my session was about the expectations of membership, including the expectation of financial support. I urged our potential members to think about their connection with the community in terms of the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure, and how we hoped that they could be involved in all 3 ways. Based on Fowler's work, I wanted to reassure them that we understood how not everyone could give at the same levels, and that our involvement naturally changed over the course of our lives. Sending a child to college, going into retirement, having a medical emergency. Any number of life events can change how available we are to our other relationships. I especially wanted them to understand that we don't think less of our members who have less to give, but that every one of us makes this a stronger spiritual community when we are involved. You pluck one strand of the interdependent web, and the whole web reverberates as a result. One of the leadership roles that I occupied for many years in the larger Unitarian Universalist movement was on the board of the Partner Church Council, which matches congregations in the United States and Canada one-on-one with congregations in Transylvania, the Philippines, India, and Africa. All of us had joined the board because of amazing experiences that we had had as a part of those international relationships, but we struggled with how to articulate those connections for people who hadn't experienced them. At our winter meeting in Washington, D.C. several months ago, the Reverend Diane Rollert from Toronto was leading the board in a brief worship service. Holding out an empty bowl, she said, "This is a love bowl. It's empty now, but I'm going to pass it around the circle, and I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to help fill it with love." Perhaps you can recall a moment in your international connections when you experienced a lot of love, when your heart overflowed with the power of that connection. And you can share some of that memory with the love bowl. As we passed the bowl around, each of us mimed placing love into it and shared aloud a time from our international work when our hearts had been stretched and expanded by an especially eye-opening encounter. I thought especially of my 2 years working in Transylvania at the Unitarian Seminary and the many moments of generosity that those kind people had shared with me. When the bowl returned to Diane, she noted how full it felt, and more than one of us were brushing away tears, not at the act of receiving a bowl that others had already filled for us, but at the power of making our own contribution to that fullness. Our involvement in a spiritual community can be about more than getting our personal needs met. It's about pouring some of our love into a bowl that others are also filling. and understanding our various ways of giving as spiritual practice, as important to our wholeness as breathing deeply, thinking freely, and extending compassion to others. American Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield wrote, "Spiritual maturity is an acceptance of life in relationship." And I believe that the membership in a healthy spiritual community ultimately offers a more substantial and transformative experience than even our individual journeys can. With this in mind, I think it's important to hold up the kind of community that does successfully foster this culture of involvement. First of all, a healthy community encourages its members to take their involvement seriously as part of our spiritual work. And it also trusts our ability to decide how and how much we can be involved at any one time in our lives. Second, a healthy community does a good job of keeping its members informed about how their gifts and involvement are being used. And its members reward that transparency with trust in their leadership. Third, a healthy community keeps its culture of generous involvement sustainable and protects its members from burnout by preparing the next generations of leaders and training other people to enjoy the privilege of being at the helm. Fourth, a healthy community understands that some degree of risk is required to put our shared values into action, and that an atmosphere of scarcity and anxiety makes it much more difficult to pursue our dreams, individually and as a community. Fifth and lastly, a healthy community responds gently when things don't go as planned, as they very often will. We and our leaders are only human, after all. Our goal is not to be a community that has no struggles, but a community that responds out of a vision of deep and transformative commitment. Ultimately, this service is not about asking more of you, not demanding that you be more involved in this community, but inviting you to reflect on how the most important questions of your life may also be explored in a community like this one. I'm asking you to consider this particular vision of involvement not only because I know from experience that satisfaction naturally makes us want to participate more, but also that your own journey can be transformed and magnified by being involved in a community like this one. And so with this in mind, I'd like to leave you with a few more questions to consider. Do you have a memory of when this community or another community like it helped you to experience a special amount of love or meaning? What made that moment possible? When is this community at its very best? What makes this quality possible? When there is tension or disagreement in your community, what is its most healthy and constructive response? What makes this response possible? And lastly, when is this community doing its best job of welcoming and celebrating a diversity of vision and values? How can you help this to be true more often? Many of the questions that James Fowler asks us as individuals can also be asked of us as a community, with our answers pointing to what lies at the heart of our shared spiritual journey. I am so grateful to be part of a movement, a network of communities like this one that encourages a free and responsible search for meaning. And my life has benefited so much from the diverse and caring communities that I give myself to. I hope that you will have that experience and that this community can be such a place for you. May it be so.